Hi, I'm Megan Bever, a book review editor for the Journal of the Civil War Era. Today I am here with J. Matthew Ward. He is assistant professor of history at Quincy University in Illinois. He holds his MA in U.S. history from the University of Missouri and a PhD in U.S. history from Louisiana State University. In 2023, he was one of 20 fellows at the Summer Seminar in Military History, which was hosted by the World War II Museum in New Orleans. His research and teaching interests include the U.S. Civil War, antebellum America, environmental history, U.S. slavery, U.S. women's history, U.S. popular culture, military history, and gender studies. Today, we are going to chat about his book, Garden of Ruins, Occupied Louisiana in the Civil War, which was published by LSU Press in 2024. All right, it's good to see you. Thanks for
Thank you for
joining us.
having me.
Absolutely. So, could you start by telling us a little bit about how you became interested in studying occupation in Louisiana?
Sure. I was born and raised in Mississippi, so not too far from Louisiana. So I grew up around Civil War battlefields. I was much more interested in that than, video games and other things that other kids liked as a young man. And I'm very grateful for my parents for, carting me around all over the South to different battlefields. And one day, I was a senior or either junior or senior in college, and I was trying to think about what I wanted to do for a final project. And I was at the Corinth Interpretive Center, which is excellent, by the way. I haven't been in a while. I don't know if they've made any substantial changes, but it's a really great interpretive center for the value of Corinth, which was also occupied by Union forces. And they had a little exhibit on what I would call what most of us in the field would deem social history, right? So that they had a portion of the diary of Kate Cummings there, who's a Confederate nurse, and some other sort of behind the scenes interaction between civilians and military figures in Corinth. And so I did my senior thesis on Confederate women's diaries. I did my master's thesis at Missouri with Leanne Whites on Confederate women under occupation across the South. And of course, her edited volume with Alicia Long, Occupied Women, was hugely influential for me. And she introduced me to the concept of household war, which was hugely influential as well. And by the time I got to LSU, I wanted to expand that work. I was really interested in the overlap of social and military history, and occupation's a great place to study that. So I went over to Hill Memorial Library and started digging around, and I was in Louisiana. Most of the sources there relate to Louisiana, so that's sort of a project that shaped itself. But it comes from a much longer trajectory in my life of just being interested in the Civil War and being a Southerner, and uh, that sense of the Civil War always being quite present in the life and minds of Southerners is still kind of there. Not as much as it was when I was a kid, but that's what got me really interested in it.
That's really interesting. And you brought up already the household war and working with Leanne Whites. So you apply this concept of the household war to occupation. That's the lens that you're looking through when you're looking at Louisiana. So could you talk a little bit more about how household war and that framework helps us to understand questions of loyalty and citizenship?
Sure. So, household war, and there are other scholars that kind of do this as well, and there are other terms that capture these similar ideas. You could call it home front studies, you could call it domestic warfare, you could call it civil military relations. I feel like all of these terms overlap with each other very strongly. Household war is just the phrase I went with because that's the one I was most familiar with from my research and time with not only Dr. White's, but just having read a lot of Southern sources and what is life like behind the lines. So household war is this term that White's and also Lisa Kendrick Frank have done a lot of work with. It's sort of, as I see it, three overlapping ideas of the material production of the household. Southerners especially are producing clothing and food and information for their families and for soldiers. It's also the familial and social relations that are contained in that household. And especially in terms of guerrilla war, having a base of supply and relation is very important for Southern armies. And it also involves the policies that have to do with the household. And Benjamin Butler is quite frankly writing all these orders to try to get Confederate citizens, especially Confederate women, sort of hemmed in. How much success he has with that depends on one's perspective. So, from my reading of military occupation, not only in Louisiana, but in most places and in most wars, to be frank, occupation is about subduing and providing for the civilian population. And you have to make sure that that civilian population doesn't rise up against the army, but also you want to make sure they're not fueling or feeding the opposition with information and food and other things. So uh, what Butler and other Union figures and Confederate figures do as well is they're constantly trying to constrain their civilian populations in the domestic arena. So making sure they take loyalty oaths, making sure they're paying taxes, threatening their property if they don't do these things. Both sides very much are concerned with the kind of money that civilians are using. Governor Moore of Louisiana, the Confederate governor, the first Confederate governor, issues this order. It's like, make sure you're not using U.S. money. And then when the Union Army arrives in New Orleans, they're taking up all the Confederate money. So all these things that really hit home, to pun intended, with Unionists and Confederate civilians. So much of their war it revolves around providing for their families, protecting their property, and that's what I see as a household war. Because Confederate civilians and Unionist civilians and formerly enslaved people are constantly badgering both armies for protection, for rations, for permission to go in and out of the lines, and a lot of this has to do with just surviving day to day.
You have this really interesting conversation that goes through the book where you're looking at that reorientation, right? Especially for men, white men
Yeah,
from the family to like get them to basically to get them to think of their loyalty and their identity in connection with the nation,
yeah,
which I thought was a really interesting theme that comes back up. But you also talk a lot about Black Louisianans,
yeah,
and the extent to which I guess maybe the household war seems to apply to them a bit differently. And
yes.
there are some similarities with white families and white people, but there's also some significant differences. And I wondered if you could speak about that a little bit.
Absolutely. So, Union military officials hire a lot of loyal, depending on who they hire, white people to fill out the occupation administration, right? They need a lot of harbor masters and store clerks and police officers, so other than the oath of allegiance and making sure that they apply themselves correctly to all the laws that are being passed or orders that are being passed, uh, white men really only have one thing they have to worry about, which is getting a job and providing for their family as they have traditionally done. When union occupation comes in, it means some profound differences or changes for enslaved people, but maybe not as many positive ones as they could have hoped for. So the best parts of union occupation are freedom, education, access to more resources, free labor contracts, and the opportunity to join the army, recruitment, a good opportunity. On the other hand, free labor is often manipulative and coercive. They don't always get the finances that they're owed. So that's a big distinction between white men being able to provide for their families and black men and women, is they don't always get their wages. Oftentimes, black men are more or less coerced into the Union Army or into labor gangs to work on various defenses and levies. And the Confederate Army does the same thing. So they are fundamentally separated, black men, from their families. And that really wounds their ability to maintain a strong family unit and to build a household, again, a physical place, but also a social place. and to maintain the strength of that household in the same way that white people are. So basically, from that chapter on, I try to hammer the point that by the end of the Civil War and into the Reconstruction years, slavery may have gone away because of Union occupation, but white people do not necessarily accept black people as equal members of the national household. And you can see that in the policies and in the treatment that black people experience under occupation.
Yeah, that comes through really clearly as you're reading the
Good.
book. It's like we're reorienting the household, we're rethinking the nation to a point.
Yeah.
And when it gets to white supremacy, that just seems to be where it doesn't quite
Yeah.
shift as much as maybe we would hope from our vantage point in 2025. So you mentioned Butler earlier.
Yeah.
And you do wade into the scholarly debate on Ben Butler's character. He gets, a whole chapter and then he shows up other places in the book. So, what's your take on Butler?
Butler is a mediocre field commander, but an excellent administrative figure. And I'll die on that hill. That doesn't mean I necessarily agree with everything Butler does, but I think that too many people have dismissed Butler as, Spoon's Butler, and he's just got sticky fingers and he's running around rampant in the Gulf South, taking everything he can get his hands on. I don't think that is the case. And if it is the case, he's hardly alone in either the Union armies or the Confederate armies and just sort of like taking stuff that doesn't belong to him. So he's gotten a bad rap in that regard. I should say that I was surprised in writing this book as I was reading through all of the historiography on Butler that professional historians have not treated him that poorly. They really haven't. They come at him with a more measured understanding and try to contextualize him appropriately. It is more the pop culture references to Butler that remain so focused on this negative image. I work here at Quincy University, my very first year here. Someone from the art department introduced themselves to me and asked me about my research, and I talked about Louisiana, and they said, "Oh, Spoon's Butler." I did a presentation here to the local Civil War roundtable. Someone brought a chamber pot, a reproduction, not an original, but a chamber pot with Butler's face at the bottom, and was like, "Yeah, this is what it was like." They wanted to relieve themselves on Butler, and I said, "Well, maybe some Southerners, but we a lot of people miss this idea that Butler's, I think, a legitimate hard war commander. Grant and Sherman get all of the credit for this, and John Pope to some extent. And this usually starts in like 1864 with the Overland Campaign or the Atlanta Campaign. But I think if we rewind and start with people like Butler and Pope, and to some extent even Banks in the Shenandoah Valley, we could see that the Union Army is trying out these hard war policies a lot earlier than some people choose to remember. And if you start with Grant and Sherman and look back, these other guys look like scoundrels. But if you start with Banks and Butler and others and look forward, you can see that they're part of a longer trajectory of hard war in the South. So that's how I choose to interpret Butler.
That seems fair.
Yes.
Yeah, and I like that, you give him his administrative, yeah, he's got his chops there, and his talents. I appreciate that. Um, so my final question is, of course, to look toward Reconstruction because I think most of the time, as historians, if we're looking at federal occupation during the war, we are somehow trying to figure out how it ties in to Reconstruction. And you've mentioned Reconstruction a little bit already in our conversation, but can you talk a little bit about what you think federal occupation in Louisiana tells us about Reconstruction?
Absolutely. I think that occupation dismantled slavery, but in many ways it preserves white supremacy. Not in the very aggressive way that, say, the Klan will preserve white supremacy, but in an administrative policy sort of way. People like Banks, General Nathaniel Banks, has much more success with the free labor program than Butler because he's there a lot longer. The way that Black people are treated in this very paternalistic, almost childlike way that they have to have their wages guarded and they have to have their work schedules overseen. Aside from the elimination of physical punishment, it looks a lot like slavery. And I think the fact that union occupation is in such a hurry to hire white loyalists, many of which hope to maintain slavery in some sort of moderate way, or at least don't want to equate black people and white people. If you take a look at the revised state government that Union occupation helps set up in 1864, they do not extend the franchise to black men. They expand a little bit of education funding for black schools. And of course, if you look at the free labor program, black people are continued to they continue to experience a second class citizenship under occupation. And that's not to say that every single occupier feels that way, but many of them do, and they do not set up a biracial democracy after the war. And unfortunately, occupation does a lot of good things. It really challenges Confederate culture in many ways and reorients white manhood back towards loyalty and nationalism, but they don't do the same for black people. And unfortunately, they're just another cog in the wheel, in my opinion, in this the mechanism of Reconstruction that establishes Jim Crow and basically maintains the status quo of racism in the United States for a long time.
Thank you. That this is a really interesting study, and I found it despite the fact that it is in some ways a case study because you're just looking at Louisiana, it felt really like multifaceted. And there was a lot of good research, a lot of good material to think over. So I really appreciate you talking with me today, making time to chat with the Journal of the Civil War Era.
Thank you so much. I am happy to have done it.
Absolutely.